Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining in here today. We're going to talk about moving beyond imposter syndrome and how to take your first steps as a leader. Perhaps you're a seasoned leader and you're thinking, I'm well into my first steps. I'm quite beyond the first step stage. But I'd encourage you to plug into this content because perhaps the way you've been walking isn't as effective as it might be. So, to get us started here, I'm going to dive right into a story. And I had worked with this client. This was actually pre-COVID. She was a director and had recently been promoted from a senior manager. On paper, she was crushing it, exceeding her KPIs, building her team, getting recognition. But in our private sessions, she shared how she worked until midnight most nights, triple checking her decisions, double checking and triple checking her work. And she was convinced that somehow people were going to figure out she wasn't ready for this role, despite her track record of success, despite the fact that she already had the job. And what you didn't see in her LinkedIn updates was how she'd sit in her car for 10 minutes before team meetings practicing her talking points, or how she needed continual reassurance, this proof that she was capable, the tears she cried, and the anguish that she felt. Imposter syndrome has become almost trendy to talk about. It's a buzzword in leadership circles. I have imposter syndrome has become like a badge we wear, another weight that we carried along with our other perceived shortcomings. But after a decade in talent development, I have observed something much more insidious. We are normalizing the exhausting internal battle without addressing its root cause. What I've discovered working with leaders is that imposter syndrome isn't just about self-doubt. It's that gap between the polished public narrative of leadership success and the messy human reality of growth. We see the LinkedIn updates, the promotions, and the achievements, but we don't see these leaders practicing their talking points in the car before a meeting. We celebrate the visible wins, but we stay silent about the invisible work, the emotional labor, the self-questioning, the late night checking of decisions over and over again, the personal and professional self-sacrifices that we make. And so this is what we're here to talk about today. This disconnect between the highlight reel of leadership and its daily reality. This isn't just creating imposters, it's creating an exhausted, high-achieving workforce who believes that they need to work harder, know more, and be perfect to deserve their success. Truly, this unattainable bar that we set for ourselves. The real issue isn't that you feel like an imposter, it's that we've created a leadership culture that makes authenticity feel like a liability rather than an asset. So in the time that we have left together, about 24 minutes, here's the promise. We're going to dive into why traditional leadership success stories are causing you to doubt yourself. I'm going to validate you. I'm going to start by validating you right here and now. You are not alone. Many, many people experience imposter syndrome, or what I think is a more helpful term, imposter thoughts, yours truly included. So in this brief time we have together, we're going to unpack what a real leadership journey looks like, the parts that people don't post about. And I'm going to share a practical framework for building authentic confidence that doesn't require you to work longer hours or become someone you're not. So let's jump in by debunking a few myths of imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome itself is defined as the persistent belief that your success is due to luck or external factors rather than your capabilities, even in the face of clear evidence of your competence. I don't know how many times I have spent talking to friends and clients and colleagues, showing the evidence. Look how great you are. Look what you have done. Does not matter. Because simply put, imposter syndrome is your belief that others overestimate your competence. I'm going to say that again. It is your belief that others overestimate your competence. Notice how many times I use that word your. That's twice in my simplified definition. The first step in dealing with your imposter syndrome is to acknowledge that this is an internal struggle of me, myself, and I. Yes, your upbringing, your culture, your gender, your ethnicity, all of that, your sexual orientation, all of that combines to make you you, and that's the lens through which you view the world. But imposter syndrome and imposter thoughts, that's not something that's done to you, that comes within the self. But we're not going to stay there. We're not going to, enjoy the warm cloak of something familiar. I can't do it. I'm not good enough. No, because even though this is going on inside of you, many people experience the same thing. And that's actually the first myth that we're talking about here today, that it's just you dealing with imposter syndrome. In reality, studies consistently show that 70 to 80% of people have experienced imposter syndrome at some point in their lives. And we're going to get into who those people are here in just a minute. But I hope that that stat is comforting to you. Just because you're experiencing imposter thoughts right now or imposter syndrome, however you feel, most called to own that, you don't have to stay there and you're not alone while you are there. The second common myth is that imposter thoughts make me a bad leader, or I'm struggling with feeling like I'm an imposter, therefore that's going to affect my performance. There's this great study from Basima Taufik. She's an assistant professor at MIT Sloan. And in a 2002 study, she found that employees who have imposter thoughts actually adopted a more other-focused orientation in their social interactions. And as a result, they were rated as more interpersonally effective, i.e., emotionally intelligent, by their peers. In her study found, along with other studies, there is no empirical quantitative evidence that imposter thoughts degrade performance. So we can throw that myth out the window. Just because this is an experience you're going through does not make you a bad leader, a bad person, a bad fill in the blank. There's another myth, one that actually I've unknowingly perpetuated, and that is that women and people of color experience imposter thoughts more than their white male counterparts. But actually, this 2002 study from Professor Taufik and other studies have found that there isn't a significant difference between these groups. And we don't have time to dig into this at length today, but if there are underrepresented people within your team, or perhaps you fall into one of those underrepresented groups, consider diving into what those imposter thoughts are. Professor Taufik suggests a deeper conversation around inclusion and that perhaps there could be some mislabeling going on here. So if imposter thoughts are first and foremost yours to deal with, and they don't actually degrade your performance, why are we even talking about it? We're talking about it because imposter thoughts, while they don't degrade your performance, they exact a different type of toll. They create exhausted high achievers who believe they need to work harder, know more, and achieve this level of perfectionism to deserve their success. Think about it. If you're constantly questioning your competence, you might burn valuable energy managing your anxiety instead of leading your people. I talk a lot about burnout because yours truly has experienced it more than one time. You overtax yourself unnecessarily by working late, by double, triple checking your decisions. And in general, there's a sense of over preparing that takes place when you're in this space of imposter syndrome. And lastly, and we do know that this one applies more to women than men, you can pass up opportunities because you don't feel ready. But here's what's really fascinating. Imposter thoughts aren't actually the core problem. I see this as more of an issue around how we think about leadership success. We're falling into what's called survivorship bias. And I've already advanced the slides here. I did a post several weeks ago about Abram Wald. He was this incredible statistician who unfortunately left this world too early. But he analyzed damage patterns on the returning bomber planes, on the returning U.S. bomber planes. And while initially, the generals and the strategic military leaders were saying, where these red dots are, this is exactly where we need to be reinforcing the plane. And he says, well, hang on, that's kind of a flawed conclusion, because the most vulnerable areas were the ones that didn't show damage on the returning aircraft. Because if you got hit in any of these white spaces, you were done so. Your plane didn't make it back. So essentially, looking at only the surviving planes skewed the data. So I've got down here in the blue boxes, this is actually where they suggested reinforcement. This most dangerous damage wasn't visible because those planes never returned. And focusing on only what or who survived, you miss critical data about what didn't. And that's exactly what's happening in our leadership development space today. And as a quick aside, this is why I am such a fan of having organizational exit interviews and tracking turnover metrics. These are your proverbial planes that didn't make it back. And depending on the size of your organization, you could even narrow this focus to say your top 100 leaders or your rising leaders who are going to be the future leaders of your company. So there's lots of ways that you can apply this within an organizational context. But we're talking about you today. We're talking about the individual. And we have heard these, success stories, the leader who just knew how to handle the difficult conversation, the manager who naturally commanded respect in their first team meeting. But these stories are like icebergs. We only see the tip, the final victory. What lies beneath the surface is where the real work happens. And it's so misleading when we lionize Steve Jobs and Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and Sheryl Sandberg. We look at their bullet holes, the visible strategies and decisions they made in their careers. By the way, what they chose to share, what's public information. So there's narrative crafting going on there, and there's nothing bad about that at all. In fact, that's pretty important to your leadership story is owning your story and taking control of it. But we miss critical data when all we focus on is that top part of the iceberg. The unseen struggles, the moments of doubt, the failed attempts, the support systems that made their success possible, all of that is beneath the water. And that's typically the types of topics we don't share, we don't talk about. When we study only these surviving narratives of leadership, we mistake correlation for causation. My manager worked late when they got promoted, so I need to do that too. Or one that really I struggle with so much. Well, so-and-so dropped out of college and they were an amazing success, so I can do that too. But you're ignoring this huge sample size of other people that did that and didn't make it to the top or get that success that you're trying to achieve. We overlook the role of context and support systems. And lastly, we create a distorted image of what normal leadership development looks like. And then we perpetuate it. So you can see how this is this really insidious cycle that we can go through. Selective storytelling doesn't just create unrealistic expectations, it actively feeds imposter syndrome. Because when you're in the midst of your leadership journey, experiencing all the messy, uncertain parts that never make it into the leadership books, we're talking about the stuff below the water, it can be natural to conclude that you are doing something wrong. You are the only one that's struggling. Real leaders don't face these challenges. What's wrong with me? But like these World War II bombers, the most vulnerable parts of our leadership are often the ones we never see discussed on LinkedIn, celebrated in business magazines, or even talked about in team meetings. The late night doubts, the practice presentations, the mentor and support system calls, the moments of uncertainty. These aren't signs you're failing at leadership. This is evidence that you're actually doing the real work of growing as a leader. So we've got about 15 minutes left. I'm going to introduce you, as promised, to one of my favorite tools that you can begin applying right here, right now, to take control of your imposter thoughts. You are not your thoughts. Even though you may feel like your thoughts, you actually have control over your thoughts. So this achievement recognition framework, as I call it, is part of helping us combat this distortion of selective storytelling and survivorship bias within leadership success. So this is focused on the individual, and it's a way for you to become more honest and create a sustainable way to recognize your growth while building authentic confidence. So I'm not saying, well, slap on what Sheryl Sandberg did or let's follow Jeff Bezos. I mean, it may be, and certainly there are leadership lessons we can glean from successful leaders. But what we're talking about is you. And this framework has been something that I've used within my own leadership journey when I found myself constantly measuring my progress against an impossible ideal, or very early on in my career, feeling competitive and comparative with my teammates, which I realized pretty quickly not a super great way to build a strong team dynamic. But also, no one wants a leader who was a peer and was competitive with them and now is overseeing them. So this achievement recognition framework, it's become one of the most powerful tools that I use with my clients to help them break free of comparing themselves to others or to that myth of the perfect leader. So the first step is this daily wins documentation. It's not about only celebrating big victories. And this is where you begin to build that daily muscle of noticing small moments that show your growth as a leader. It's about capturing moments in real time, the small everyday victories that often go unnoticed. It's forward-looking and helps build a habit of recognition. So I'm going to pause now. You got about 20 seconds. Think about your last workday. What was one small thing that you did that past you would have found challenging? Just give you a moment to reflect on that. Could be as simple as speaking up in a meeting, sharing uncomfortable feedback, making a decision without validation. Whatever it is, write it down. For these daily win documentation, I suggest, budgeting time in your day. This does not need to be an extra 20, 30 minutes. I mean, literally give yourself 90 seconds and write down as many things as you can. That's how quickly this can be incorporated into your life. The second part builds on the first. So instead of seeing your challenges as proof of inadequacy, we want to reframe them as evidence of your expansion. Your mind is incredibly powerful. And I love this quote from Bruce Lee. Don't speak negatively about yourself, even as a joke. Your body doesn't know the difference. So when you're framing something as, I can't do this because, I've got a little phrase for you to start incorporating. The fact that I'm facing this challenge means ... So think about your most recent leadership challenge and complete this sentence. For example, the fact that I'm worried about giving feedback means that I care both about results and relationships. How in the world does that make you inadequate? In the beginning, as is often the case when you're trying to reframe thoughts that aren't helpful, it might feel a little bit artificial. Like, well, I don't actually believe that. I see great leaders deliver difficult feedback all the time. Yeah, but were you there the first time they did it? Or maybe the first time they did it in a new company where they didn't have deep relationships? So again, this is part of refocusing what you consider to be a challenge as evidence of your growth. And the last step in the process, I call this the proof portfolio. So this is about building that concrete record of your capability that can anchor you during moments of doubts. This is your historical record of tangible achievements. Sidebar, this is also super important to keeping your resume updated, because by the time you get to the point where you're like, I got to update this resume, you're reaching back sometimes 6 months, a year, 5 years, 8 years. So by following this achievement recognition framework, it's going to have a positive impact in other parts of your life. But a place to begin, think of a recent project or initiative that you led. Find one specific piece of evidence. I'm talking KPI, a deliverable that shows your impact. And that may be something like positive team feedback. Write it down. Don't just say, well, everybody was really happy with this. No, get specific about that outcome or the problem that you solved. This becomes part of your proof portfolio. Now, this achievement recognition framework is so critical because we need to understand that it's about learning to accurately see ourselves and the value that we bring as a leader today. It's not about, I'll be successful when. Yes, I am 100% a proponent of a growth mindset, i.e., we continue to develop ourselves. But when we begin to document daily wins in the moment and reframe the way that we talk to ourselves and about ourselves, we then can more easily see the tangible achievements, the outcomes that come from who we are and don't require us changing at all. So to wrap us up, we've got a few minutes left. I wanted to quickly review the insights that we've covered. We debunked some myths about imposter syndrome, mainly that you're not alone. 70 to 80% of the population has experienced this, and this includes white men. So I'm not just talking to women in underrepresented groups. I am talking about our entire population. 70 to 80% of people, these are the stats that are consistently cited, have experienced imposter thoughts at some period of time. Imposter syndrome is an energy drain that comes from comparing our messy, real leadership journey to polished highlight reels. And no doubt that social media does not help with this. Now, I'm not saying go on LinkedIn and post about all your failures. No. But you can begin to normalize your imposter thoughts for you. And once you have a good handle on that, you can begin to help others move through that. We also talked about World War II and survivorship bias and how that plays in with imposter syndrome. It's really that missing half of success. How do people, make it to the top? Sure, we need to look at that. But we also need to look at when people didn't make it. And where do these dropout points occur in our talent development cycle? But for you as an individual, this achievement recognition framework is a practical tool that can help you build sustainable confidence. Remember, it's daily wins documentation, it's growth signal reframe, and it's your proof portfolio. So this is just the beginning of the conversation. If you'd like to dive in deeper on how to build sustainable leadership confidence, please scan this QR code, join my mailing list, and let's continue the conversation. Thanks so much for attending today. Bye, everyone.